Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here with Dr. Tyler McNabb, who is currently a Houston resident. We thank God for that. And I couldn't be more excited about our guest today. You're going to have to forgive me if I stumble a little bit through this interview because I'm a bit starstruck. But we have Dr. Linda Zagzebski, and anybody who's been doing philosophy of religion for more than 2 seconds knows who she is, but I'll do a quick intro. Dr. Zagzebski is the George Lynn Cross Research Professor Emeritus, as well as the Kingfisher College Chair of the Philosophy of Religion and Ethics Emeritus at the University of Oklahoma. Obviously, Dr. Zagzebski has done a ton on foreknowledge and freedom, omnisubjectivity, all things philosophy of religion, and just philosophy in general. So I know Tyler and I are incredibly honored to have Dr. Zagzebski here. Dr. Zagzebski, how are you doing today? Thank you so much for coming.
I'm just doing great. Beautiful day in Santa Fe. So I'm happy to talk to you. Looking forward to it.
We're so grateful. And I know you've been traveling a ton. And so, trying to coordinate this, I was thinking there's no way she's gonna be able to do this with all the stuff you have on your schedule. So truly, truly thankful. We got so much we want to talk about today. So I'll dive right into it. Our guests will know that I'm working on the theological fatalist argument, the foreknowledge and freedom problem for my PhD. And so I was laughing before we got on that this is sort of a selfish interview, though I know our listeners are going to love it just as much as I do. But why don't we start with that? Sort of, what is fatalism and why do people care about it?
Fatalism is something that has captured the human imagination since ancient times. The basic idea of it is that we don't control our lives. Everything that happens to us is fated. It's brought about by some force. It could be an impersonal force or a personal force, but whatever it is, it takes away our ability to control our lives. When you look at literature, you see Cicero wrote a treatise on fate, De Fato. Before Cicero, the Greeks were fascinated with fate. You see this particularly, and everybody's read Sophocles' tragedy about Oedipus. That's about fate. And fate seems to be something fearsome. And yet there are arguments that seem to lead us to the conclusion that we can't escape it. There are two very different forms of fatalism. One is the kind of fatalism where there's a particular event that's fated and it will happen no matter what happens first. So the story of Oedipus is like that. Oedipus was fated, according to the oracle, to kill his father and marry his mother. And the idea was no matter what he did, that was going to happen. The ancient appointment with death legend is a story like that. In this story, we are told that a merchant and his servant go to the marketplace in Baghdad, and the servant sees death beckoning to him. And in a panic, the servant goes to the merchant and says, "Quick, give me your horse. Please loan me your horse. I've got to ride to Samara. I want to get away from death." So the merchant says, "Okay, I could take my horse." So off he goes on the horse. And then the merchant sees death in the marketplace and says, "Why did you threaten my servant just now?" And death says, "Oh, I wasn't threatening him. I was just surprised to see him here because we have an appointment in Samara tonight." And that story is, it's amusing, but it expresses a kind of fate that's particularized to a certain event. And the idea is you're not going to be able to escape it no matter what you do. The other kind of fatalism, with a much longer literature in philosophy, is global fatalism. And this is the kind of fatalism where every event is fated. And every event is fated because every event is such that nothing else could happen but that event. It wouldn't happen if certain other events didn't happen first, but those events are fated too. So even though, if we want to apply that to the appointment of death story, on the global fatalist idea, maybe the servant wouldn't die if he didn't go to Samara. But his decision to go to Samara itself was fated, and that was fated by previous events, and those events were fated by previous events. So the whole chain of events is fated. And this makes it look like nothing happens that we have anything to say about. In Christianity, global fatalism has taken the form of theological fatalist argument. And this is a global fatalist argument where God knows everything will happen in the future. And because of God's infallibility, whatever God knows will happen must happen. God cannot be wrong. God has comprehensive knowledge of everything in the future. So every single thing that happens seems to be fated by the fact that God has comprehensive and infallible knowledge of the future. We cannot do anything other than we do. Nothing can happen other than what happens. And that seems to not only take away free will, but seems to make the entire universe seem to operate by a kind of fatal clockwork. And that's the kind of fatalism that Christian philosophers have written about for so long.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we're going to jump into that. But real quick, before we do, can you briefly describe what logical fatalism is?
Yeah. Okay, so logical fatalism is also a form of global fatalism. The argument has the same form, actually, as the theological fatalist argument. But instead of beginning with the assumption that there's a God who has infallible foreknowledge, it begins with the assumption that there are truths about the future. And it takes the global form because everything that will happen in the future can be expressed in propositions true, a long time ago. And then the argument is, given that it was true yesterday, that I would be talking to you today in this podcast, when it was time for the podcast, there was nothing I could do about it, just because truth values don't change. Propositions are either true all the time or never. So given that it was true forever that I would talk to you when it was time for this podcast, it looks like I couldn't do anything but talk to you when the time came. So it's also global fatalism, but the premise that starts it off is not a premise about God, but about the truth of future propositions or propositions about the future.
Got it. Excellent. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. So let's go ahead and dive into the theological fatalist argument. And before we get into sort of the presentation, maybe we can talk a little bit about the two sort of suppositions that light the fire that is the fatalist argument, and those being divine foreknowledge and human free will. So can you define those terms for us and how they play into the argument?
Right. So the aspect of divine foreknowledge that generates the argument is that God not only knows what will happen in the future, but God knows it infallibly, meaning he can't be mistaken. So you and I know all sorts of things that will happen in the future, but we know it in a way that could be falsified. We don't know it in such a way that we could not be wrong. But God's knowledge of the future is infallible. He cannot be wrong. So that element is essential to the way the argument develops. First, God has infallible foreknowledge and comprehensive infallible foreknowledge. So this applies to everything. And then the second element is that human beings have free will, in a sense of free will that implies that we could do otherwise than we do. So you don't actually need a very precise definition of free will to get the problem of the argument, but you do need the assumption that whatever free will is, it's incompatible with the ability to do otherwise.
And then human freedom. What's the sort of notion of human freedom that philosophers have in mind when dealing with the theological fatalist argument?
Yes, and I think I misspoke. I meant to say whatever free will is, it entails the ability to do otherwise.
Oh, sorry,
so
you did
incompatible. I meant to say it's incompatible with any notion of free will that doesn't have that element. So I
No, you're good.
backwards.
No, I think you did say that. I messed up. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I told everybody I was going to be nervous before this.
No, I made a mistake. So I confused you.
So, okay. So with all that laid out, maybe before I get into the actual formal derivation that you lay out, maybe sort of a rough story of
Sure.
what it is,
Yeah.
What's going on here.
Yeah. So, take something you're going to do tomorrow, something where you could do it or not as you wish. Suppose you're going to go to the grocery store and pick up some items you need. Okay. So if you're going to go to the grocery store tomorrow, it's true that you're going to go to the store tomorrow, and we'll assume that there's a God has infallible foreknowledge. And so God knew infallibly yesterday that you would go to the store tomorrow. In fact, God infallibly knew long before yesterday that you would go to the store tomorrow. So now when tomorrow comes, it looks like, since God can't make a mistake, you can't do anything else but to go to the store. So it looks like you don't have free will because you don't have the ability to do otherwise than to go to the store.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And the challenge that you took on and that Pike took on was to, how do you make this formal? And so the most popular version of the argument in the literature today is your version. And so I thought it'd be really helpful and interesting to go through that, the derivation that you lay out to really show logically how this argument works. And so when I look at it, it seems you could break the longer derivation down into three smaller derivations. And so I thought we'd go through each one at a time.
Okay.
So here's the first three premises of the argument. Yesterday, God believed infallibly that P, and that's divine foreknowledge, where P is some event in the future. If an event E occurred in the past, then it is accidentally necessary that E occurred then, and that's the necessity of the past. And then three, it is now necessary that yesterday God believed that P, and that's from 1 and 2 modus ponens. And so, and I guess it's worth noting too that P is a future contingent, right? So a future free action. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, maybe, what I'm really interested in, and I think what's unique in your derivation that you don't see a lot in the literature, well, now you do, but it's sort of unique to the theological fatalist argument, is this idea of accidental necessity and now necessity. So maybe you could talk through the premises and then specifically how that mechanism works in there.
Sure. So the idea of accidental necessity comes from William of Ockham in the 14th century. And Ockham proposed that there's a kind of necessity that's accidental in the sense that a proposition doesn't have it all the time. The proposition acquires this form of necessity at a certain point in time. So if a proposition P is true, it's always true throughout time, past, present, future. But it only becomes necessary at the time the event is about. So suppose we're taking the event of past spilling of milk, the idea that you can't do anything about spilled milk. The idea here is if the milk spills at a certain time, it's true at all times that the milk spills at that time. But until the milk actually spills, it's accidentally contingent that it spills. There's a potentiality in things for it to spill and a potentiality in things for it not to spill. There's a potentiality that goes both ways. And so the proposition that it spills is accidentally contingent. But when the milk actually spills, the world loses the potentiality for it not to spill. And so from then on, the proposition that the milk spills is accidentally necessary. First, it was accidentally contingent. Then when the milk spills, from that point on, it's accidentally necessary. So accidental necessity is a kind of temporally relative necessity that a proposition acquires only at a certain time when the event that the proposition is about.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great. I know my advisor pressed me when he saw this term. He said, "Well, wait, you don't mean it can't be necessity across all possible worlds, right? Because there's clearly worlds that don't have the same path." So
well,
this
it's not even across all points in time. That's what's really weird about it.
Right.
It's even in this world,
right.
the proposition that the milk spills is accidentally contingent until the milk actually spills.
Right.
And then how does this apply to God? Well, the idea is anything in the past has this accidental necessity. It's already done. There's no potentiality for it to be otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So that means all of God's past beliefs are now accidentally necessary.
Great. Excellent. Okay, so we get to premise 3. It is now necessary that yesterday God believed that P. And now we go on to the second sort of derivation within the larger derivation. And so this is actually premise 4. It says necessarily, if yesterday God infallibly believed P, then P, that's infallible divine foreknowledge. 5, if R is accidentally necessary, and if necessarily, if R then S, then it is accidentally necessary that S. And that's the principle of transfer necessity. And then so this is 6. So it is now necessary that P from 3, 4, and 5. So what's interesting here in this section of the derivation is this idea of the principle of transfer of necessity. And so maybe just like you did with accidental necessity, if you could take us through how this mechanism works.
Yes. So maybe I should just clarify that. Sometimes when I formulated this argument, I say accidentally necessary, and sometimes I say now necessary, but it's the same thing. So for the argument, it might be clearer if the conclusion it is accidentally necessary that P, but it means the same thing.
And that's my fault. I probably wrote that wrong.
No, it's fine. So you're asking about the transfer of necessity principle, and this is a really interesting principle because it's modeled on what's called axiom K, which is an axiom of every formal system of modal logic. And this is an axiom that says if it's logically necessary that P, and P entails Q, then it's logically necessary that Q. This is taken to be indisputable. It's a very basic axiom about what logical necessity means. Now, as applied to accidental necessity, the transfer of necessity principle is the same thing, but with accidental necessity substituted for logical necessity. So now the principle becomes, if it's accidentally necessary that P, and P entails Q, then it's accidentally necessary that Q. And then when you apply that to foreknowledge, you have as your premise, it's accidentally necessary that God believed yesterday that I would go to the store tomorrow. And God's belief that I would go to the store tomorrow entails that I go to the store tomorrow. Therefore, it's now accidentally necessary that I go to the store tomorrow. That's how that's supposed to work. So it's a transfer of necessity, of accidental necessity principle that's modeled on the transfer of logical necessity that you find in every system of modal logic.
And that's what's so interesting and cool about this argument, and especially the way you formulated it, is that these principles that at work really aren't that controversial, right? The sort of axioms or the central dogmas or whatever you want to call them are pretty well, obviously free will, there's been debate over free will, but foreknowledge is usually generally held. And then the ingredients of the argument and the mechanisms that get the sort of necessity through to free will at the end really aren't that controversial. And so it's really a fun argument. But with that aside, we can finish with this last section here. So this would be premise 7. And this is the last section of the argument. It says, if it is now necessary that P, then you cannot do otherwise than P. That's the definition of necessity, of necessary. Then that's 7. So 8, therefore you cannot do otherwise than P. Then 9, if you cannot do otherwise when you do an act, you do not do it freely. That's the PAP, that's principle of alternate possibilities. And then therefore, when you do P, you will not do it freely. So your argument has taken God's past belief of a future contingent, attached accidental necessity to it, through using the transfer principle, got that all the way through to the end. And so now it seems like our actions in the future are fixed. And so with all that being said, I'm really interested to get into your solution to the problem, but I was curious to get your thoughts on 2 other popular solutions. One that's fairly recent, and the other one that's been talked about for a while, and that's open theism and sort of the Boethian eternalism solution. And so, and please feel free to also clear up anything I said that was incorrect. So if I know that's a lot all in one jump, I apologize. But open theism and the eternal solution, maybe your thoughts on that.
Sure. So for theists who think the argument we've talked about is valid, and who want to reject the conclusion, one of the premises has to be false. So there are theists who say that we do not have free will in a sense that involves alternate possibilities. And there are plenty of people who think that, who aren't theists. And there's arguments that say free will does not require alternate possibilities. And so they can use that line as a way to avoid the fatalist conclusion. In other words, we can have free will, even though we don't act in a way in which there's alternate possibilities. So that's one approach. The other approach is to reject the other premise, the premise that God is infallible and comprehensive foreknowledge. And that's the open theist position that you've mentioned. So according to open theism, God does not have comprehensive, infallible knowledge of the future. Although God has something close to it, God can predict with very high degree of probability what will happen. And God always has the power to intervene, whenever he sees fit, after things happen, but God doesn't actually have comprehensive, infallible foreknowledge. And my reaction to that is, well, that's a fallback position. I mean, both of these moves of denying one of the premises of the argument are fallback positions. And I'm not going to say anything particular against them, but my main point is that they are fallback positions. They're positions that you go to when you think, when you've given up on trying to figure out a way out of the theological fatalist argument. And for that reason, I don't think of or pursue them that much, because I think there are ways out of the theological fatalist argument. So that's my response to the open theism move. The other move you mentioned, which is popular and has been popular since Boethius in the 6th century and Aquinas in the 13th century, is the idea that God is not in time. So if you look at the argument that we've been discussing, the first premise of the argument is that God believed yesterday, a long time ago, that I would go to the store tomorrow. The idea is that God is in time, has beliefs in time, and God had beliefs in the past. But suppose God is not in time, God is outside of time. If God is outside of time, God didn't believe anything yesterday. or the day before or 1,000 years ago. God doesn't believe at moments of time at all. So if that's the case, the first premise of the argument is false, and the argument doesn't even get going. So that's a very popular solution, at least among people who like the idea that God is timeless, who pick up on the Thomistic idea that God is outside of time. Now, my response to that is that the timelessness move doesn't help. All it does is generate a new form of the dilemma. So if you look at the argument we've been talking about, it depends upon the necessity of the past, or accidental necessity. Once the past is over and done with, there's nothing we can do about it. Why do we think that there's no use crying over spilled milk? Well, the idea is the past has a certain ontological status. It's fixed, it's complete, it's untouchable. We can't do anything about it. And then you get the argument we've been talking about, that with a transfer of necessity to the future. But if God is in the timeless realm, that realm also seems to be fixed, complete, outside of our control. I mean, if you say you can't do anything about the past, wouldn't you also say you can't do anything about the timeless realm? So if God has beliefs in a timeless realm, isn't that kind of like beliefs in the past, outside of our control, beyond human ability to affect? That suggests that there would be a principle that's parallel to accidental necessity, not necessity of the past, but the necessity of eternity, or necessity of timelessness. And then there would be a transfer of timelessness necessity principle, and then you get the same argument. It's exactly the same argument, parallel argument, except that you would use, instead of talking about accidental necessity or necessity of the past, it would be the necessity of timelessness, or the eternal realm. So that's what I say, is that you get the same argument all over again. I do want to say that we have sayings about the necessity of the past, like there's no use crying over spilled milk. And we don't have sayings about the necessity of eternity. I mean, nobody goes around saying there's no use crying over timelessly spilling milk. I mean, nobody says stuff like that. So we don't have much of an idea about the necessity of eternity. But I say that doesn't help us that much, because we don't have much of an idea at all about what the timeless realm is. And so it might be that we have a weaker grasp on it. And in a sense that could help us, but in a sense it hurts us. We just don't know what to say about that realm. So that's what I say about it. I don't think it really gets us out of the problem.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And just one more question, and hopefully Tyler hasn't walked off and left because he's so mad at me for taking up all this time with you. But so the grand finale, can you sort of lay out your solution to the problem?
Well, in the book I wrote 30 years ago, I had several solutions, including saying that alternate possibilities, the principle of alternate possibilities is false, the transfer of necessity principle is false. I made up a solution I called Thomistic optimism. I tried a lot of different solutions. But what I think now is something else. First, I want to say something about stepping back and looking at the problem as a whole. The problem of divine foreknowledge and human free will is usually thought to be a problem that's only of interest to theists, because it has as a premise, God has infallible foreknowledge. So for people who are non-theists, you think, well, they'll just stop reading the argument. I mean, they're not interested. But actually, I think everyone, including atheists, should be interested, fascinated with this problem, because it uncovers an issue that really doesn't have anything to do with God. The problem we've been talking about starts with the premise that there is a being who has infallible knowledge of the future. The only candidate being is God, so that's why it's a theistic argument. But actually, the argument does not refer to God, or it doesn't have to. It starts out with, let's assume there's a being who has infallible knowledge of the future. And the conclusion is there's no free will. Now, even non-theists should be puzzled by that, because why would a particular knowing ability have anything to do with what's known? I mean, we don't usually think that a knowing power affects what is known. We think that if a proposition is true, that explains why you know it. We don't say your knowing it makes it true or false. You don't think that. It seems to get things backwards metaphysically. And so that should at least make anybody wonder, why should a knowing power of a certain kind, infallible kind, lead to a metaphysical conclusion that says that nothing ever acts, or everything acts, or everything occurs out of necessity? That seems weird. Even if you don't believe in God, you should think that's weird. And so I say that this is a problem that should be of interest to, anybody. Okay, so that's a kind of a warm up to why I think this should lead to an investigation of the metaphysics of time and the logic of time. And that I think there's a lot of confusions here. So the solution, and this isn't exactly a solution, but my current thinking is that there's something messed up about the idea of accidental necessity, or the necessity of the past. I'm not sure there's any such thing. When we say there's no use crying over spilled milk, why do we say that? Do we say it because the past has some sort of special modal status? Or is it because we just think there's no backwards causation? You can't cause or prevent anything in the past. Imagine that we did think there was backwards causation and that we could cause or prevent something in the past. Would we say there's no use crying over spilled milk? I don't think we would. So what I'm suggesting is this. The adage, there's no use crying over spilled milk, is expressing not a logical principle about the past, but a metaphysical principle that there's no backwards causation. That's what it means. And if that's what it means, there isn't a kind of necessity that Occam described that is actually a kind of necessity that satisfies the formal conditions of necessity and that satisfies the transfer of necessity principle. There is no necessity of the past that has those features. All we have is there's no backwards causation. Now, does that solve the problem? Well, actually what it does is it shifts it to a completely different conversation. Now we have to think about whether there is a transfer of causability principle that applies to the past. So we can't cause the past. Okay, instead of saying the past is accidentally necessary, we would say we can't cause it or prevent it. Okay, fine. We know that that's a metaphysical principle. Doesn't have anything to do with modal principles. It's just metaphysical principle. Now, what would we say about whether that lack of causability over the past can be transferred to the future by a transfer of causability principle? Maybe it can be. Maybe it can be. Not sure whether it can be or not. But notice something interesting here. This is very much like the argument that goes way back to Peter Van Wagen's argument about free will. He had this very famous principle beta. And the principle beta goes like this. If P, and we can't do anything about P, and P entails Q, then we can't do anything about Q. And this was intended to be about causal power, ability to affect things. And he thought the principle was true. If it is true, then we get another argument that God's past beliefs entail lack of free will, but it's by a different principle. It's by a principle that has to do with causation and this principle beta. Now, what's interesting about that is that might be true. That might be a valid argument we're going to have to confront. But actually, it isn't indisputable. There's a very large literature about that principle beta, variations of it, arguments that it's false, arguments that it could be tweaked to be true, more arguments that those are false. In other words, it's controversial. It's not like axiom K of modal logic. And so what I think this means is that the idea of accidental necessity modeled on modal logic doesn't work. It's just not right. It borrows a kind of logical respectability from modal logic, but there really isn't any such kind of necessity as accidental necessity. Instead, we should be talking about causes, what we can cause and what we can prevent. That shifts the whole discourse. And even though I'm not giving the solution to that, I think it means that what we should be talking about is the literature that was started with the discussion of Van Wagen's beta principle, and look at how that would pan out or how that could be applied when we're talking about God and fatalism. So that's what I actually think. We need to be talking about causes and causability. And this is as far as I've gotten since I've been doing other things since I thought of that. So that's where I am.
That is fantastic. To say I'm excited is an understatement. And I'm going to go ahead and bite my tongue because Tyler, I'm sure, is going to kill me if I follow up. But Dr. Zagzebski, thank you so much for that. Tyler, I know you're down there, and now remember, this is a Christian channel, so don't start cussing at me for too long. But go ahead, brother, you're up.
Not at all, man, not at all. So yeah, thanks very much, Linda. That was really great and interesting. I'm just curious. So Mike and I have a paper on kind of a defense of a Mysterian approach to the divine foreknowledge, human freedom problem. And I just kind of wanted to get your idea. I mean, it's kind of piggybacking on Boethius in some sense, where it's like, Boethius is right in some sense that we are oftentimes, God is timeless, right? And oftentimes we are, when we look at these problems, we kind of look at them very anthropomorphically. God has a belief. God's knowledge is propositional. God is in time and so forth. And so, let's say that, we buy into more of Thomistic metaphysics where, God doesn't have various different beliefs and God doesn't have beliefs. God is identical to his knowledge, right? And, maybe we don't even think that knowledge is propositional for God, right?
Right.
And so, when we develop the problem, we oftentimes do so as if God was a thing in the universe. Just like you, like we're applying knowledge and beliefs to God in the same way that we would apply it to another being within the universe. And so, if we talk about God having knowledge or foreknowledge, but it's in a different way, in a different sense than you and I, right? Well, then maybe the problem doesn't follow. Right? Maybe the problem, maybe what's entailed by you and I having foreknowledge, or some other thing or object in the universe having foreknowledge, and what follows from that, maybe that doesn't follow from whatever it means for God to have foreknowledge.
Sure. Yeah.
And so there's just kind of a Mysterian approach that it kind of allows. I mean, it doesn't solve the problem, so to speak, but it allows us to have kind of justified agnosticism or something like that. Anyway, I just was curious to get your sort of initial thoughts on that.
Sure. And that reminded me that a long time ago, Bill Alston had a paper called "Does God Have Beliefs?" He argued God doesn't have beliefs. So one reaction I have is that I think you're right, that everything we say about God is by analogy. I mean, I guess I accept that Thomistic line that everything we say is by analogy. We can't really say God knows, God has beliefs, the way we do when we're talking about ourselves. In fact, even when we say God exists, it probably is not in the same sense in which we exist, So it looks like we can't say anything that isn't simply based on an analogy. And I agree with that, but that doesn't actually satisfy our desire to figure things out.
Sure.
So, I mean, we still try and figure out mysteries, and then we call it a mystery when we can't figure out how to get any farther on it. We're on a line of thought, and then we get stuck, and then we say, well, it's a mystery. And that's true, but that, I guess I think that of that not as it, that shouldn't stop us from trying to push as far as we can. So I'm not sure exactly what to say. I mean, I guess I agree with you, but I wouldn't want to just stop there and say, well, then that's it. I'm not going to think about it anymore.
Sure.
So that's actually what I think about that. But I'm finding out more and more in what I'm writing now, because I'm writing a book on omnisubjectivity. And every model I think of omnisubjectivity is an analogy. It's usually a spatial metaphor of some sort. So I don't, so I guess what I want to say is I agree with you that we are always thinking in terms of analogies, but some analogies work better than others.
True.
And so we try and push it as far as we can. And then, we don't want to stop.
Right. Well, that's, go ahead, Mike.
Tyler, I was just going to say, Dr. Zagzebski, I told her about 20 to 40 minutes. So just so
okay. I'll wrap it up here.
Okay.
Forever.
I'll wrap it up here. So you told us you're working on a book on omnisubjectivity. Can you tell us a little bit about what omnisubjectivity is? And then I just had a follow-up question with that, with respect to, do you think that omnisubjectivity is consistent with the more Thomistic conception of God? So that'll be my closing question.
Okay. So what I mean by omnisubjectivity is the attribute of having a complete and perfect grasp of the subjective states of every being who has subjectivity. And I argue that the God of Christian theism must have this attribute, that it's entailed by omniscience and omnipresence, it's implied by practices of prayer, it's strongly implied by God's love and justice. So I have lots of arguments that God should be omnisubjective. And it's fairly easy to, I think, to see omnisubjectivity as compatible with timelessness and immutability, which are attributes of the classical conception of God that you find in Aquinas. I'm not sure what to say, though, about impassibility. It depends on how you define impassibility, but omnisubjectivity does seem to have the consequence that God feels things. God has emotions, God has feelings. And if impassibility is just defined as not having any feelings, as often it has been, well, then God's not impassible. But I think there's problems in thinking of God, thinking that God's perfection requires that God has no feelings. And I don't want to go into that right now. But just to answer your question, I think that omnisubjectivity is compatible with most of the atomistic view of God, possibly all of it. But I think there's some, I guess I would disagree with Aquinas about certain of his arguments about God and emotions. And so in that sense, I would say it may not be compatible with Aquinas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And in your book, any hints about when it might be finished?
Well, I mean, I'm writing it now, and I'm hoping it will be finished in the next few months, but then that doesn't mean it would be published for probably
Sure.
another year after that. But yeah, but
Wonderful.
Oxford is going to publish it, and that's, it'll be coming out.
Wonderful.
After
and
this
I'm
interview,
happy to talk.
oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, would you consider coming back on again to talk about it?
Oh, sure. I always like to talk about omnisubjectivity.
Dr. Zagzebski, thank you so much. This was just fantastic. We really appreciate
thank
your
you
time.
for having me. It was very interesting, and you forced me to think about it again. I hadn't been thinking about it for quite a while.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful for you and for your work. I know Tyler is as well, and
Indeed.
Really, really just thankful for your
Good.
time. We appreciate you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Blessings.